Yes.
I'm going to ask you some questions now about what non-financial benefits were available to beneficiaries.
Before that, sorry, I'm doing my usual thing and having a think in the break about anything else that might be useful from our previous discussion. Would you be happy for me to draw your attention to one more paper?
Yes.
Okay, this is taxed 40110_015. And it's a paper I wrote for the board on entitled Emerging Issues from May 2013. And if you go down to the bottom, it picks up on a number of issues, but at the bottom there's a paragraph on requests for regular housekeeping payments. So I say there, some people have asked for regular payments. We are ourselves aware of cases where people are living hand to mouth at risk of either going without or getting into debt. It's clear that whatever our policies, there will be a small number of households who will continue to be dependent on our support. So this is acknowledging that although we've talked a lot about dependency, in fact, let's not get too hung up on that. Dependency is in some cases inevitable, and that we could at present afford to make regular payments to our poorer clients. It should be possible to design a scheme that would make payments but avoid the risk of our becoming overspent if our number of registered clients increase significantly. So this really it goes back to the point that we were discussing earlier. This then, I think, was followed up fairly quickly by the more detailed proposals for a regular payment scheme. But there were certainly circumstances, I recall, where in particular cases we began to make some monthly payments for people who were in particularly dire circumstances. I think the board after this gave the welfare committee a bit more leeway in doing that. So again, it was about trying to use our discretion to give support to people who really needed it until we had a proper regular payment scheme.
Shamit, you can take that down now. Can I just ask you some questions about non-financial benefits? You've spoken already about the debt counsellor. Is it right to understand that there was also we've heard evidence from Mr. Bateman who
Yes.
who gave benefits advice to Caxton beneficiaries, and we can see on various documents that there was also counselling available. Is that right, from the Hepatitis C Trust?
That's correct. Yes, our staff were made people coming to us aware of that facility and gave them the contacts if they wished to apply.
Now, I'm going to turn to the office guidelines in a moment, but one of the entries on the office guidelines is for a referral to an independent financial advisor, and we've heard from the McFarlane Trust witnesses that was very much part of the initial offering to the McFarlane Trust beneficiaries when they were given their capital payments. Was that a feature at all of Caxton Foundation offering to their beneficiaries, given that lump sum payments were being made?
It wasn't. I mean, we weren't obviously making lump sum payments ourselves. That would be through the Skipton Fund, but no, we didn't offer advice, financial advice for people who'd received a lump sum or just received a lump sum through Skipton. But again, Jane Bellis' advice was not just about debt. She was a money management advisor as well. So that facility was there if people wanted it.
I'm going to ask you some questions now about what single grants were available, and I want to look at two documents before I ask the question. So the first of those is CAXT 5034_008, and it's the annual report for the year ending 31st of March 2013. we can see on the first page. Sorry, I just had that. And if we turn please to page 7 of that document, we can see a list of the kinds of support that's provided to clients, a third of the way down that page. Financial support while undergoing treatment, you've already mentioned that. Respite breaks for spouses and carers. Health and mobility related repairs and adaptations. Support with debt and money management. Financial assistance with the purchase of essential household items. Support with vehicle maintenance to ensure people can retain mobility and independence. And financial support to enable people to undergo retraining. And the second document I want to look at is the Office Guidelines from 2012, and that's CAXT 5062_076. Now this is the McFarlane version of this document is one we've looked at with McFarlane witnesses. I just want to, if I can, flick through the document. So if we go to page 1, we see something about maxima, that if there's already had more than £3,000, you go to the NWC, and then there's some information about payment of retrospective grants, and there's some information about appealing. And then if we go on to the next page, we can see accommodation related grants, setting up home, moving home, and then going through the documents to page, let's go to page 9, in fact page 7. We can see that you can get grants for cooking, mattresses, beds, furniture, clothing following weight loss or weight gain. And then if we go over to page 10, we can see their complementary therapy. And then to page 11, school change costs. Short non-academic training courses, advanced education. I've gone from the bottom there, I don't quite know why. And then if we go over to page 15, we can see wills, bereavement and further bereavement support are all offered under the Office Guidelines. So I wanted to ask you this. Are we to understand that the types of grants, of single grants that the Caxton Foundation would make are described in these two documents?
They are. There is also a later version of the Office Guidelines because as we've discussed already, we updated that periodically, which is part of the documentation. But certainly at any one time, there were other things introduced. But yes, in answer to your question.
What was the Caxton's attitude to an application for a grant that came in out with these categories?
We would look at it on its merits. Inevitably, we did have applications that came in. So, for example, I don't think at this stage the Office Guidelines mentions adaptations to people's homes explicitly. But we had a few applications to those which we granted. So people who were in an advanced state of illness with hepatitis C, who could no longer go upstairs in their homes, who wanted to have a bathroom installed downstairs, for example, were the kind of things that we certainly later paid for. And what tended to happen is that we would receive an application for something, and we would look at it on its merits and approve it or not, and then take account of that in the way we then went on to update the Office Guidelines. There were also, I think, through time, in order to speed things up, we as we gained sort of an understanding of, some applications became more routine, if you like. We would sort of increase the number of things that the office could approve, or the chief executive could approve, without waiting for an NWC meeting.
I want to ask you about the position as you understood it in June 2013. So that's the date of the first partnership group meeting. Do you recall at that meeting, and if necessary we can go to the minutes, but do you recall it becoming clear from what was said at that meeting that beneficiaries were confused about what kind of grants they could apply for? They didn't know what kind of grants were available.
Yes, that certainly was a discussion. We, as you would have heard already, we did not publish the office guidelines. Instead, we had information on the website which gave an indication of what people could apply for and the application process. I think it is fair to say that initially that was not, I think, clear enough about the types of things that people could apply for.
Would beneficiaries have received the annual report? Would they even have seen that list in the annual report about what was available?
I think the annual report was certainly published on the website. I don't think it was sent individually to beneficiaries. There's an argument for saying it should have been, but I don't honestly know if that was done by the staff. I suspect it wasn't.
I think you've said initially that the web.
Technically, who was it a report to?
So this was technically it's a public report as required by the Charity Commission of all charities. So it would be sent to the Charity Commission for publication under the Register of Charities, or it should have been. But it's also a report it ought also to be a report for the beneficiaries. In which case there is an argument for saying it should have been sent to all beneficiaries. I don't recall ever asking the question of whether it was, so I'm afraid I do not know whether it was sent or not.
I think you've accepted that certainly initially the website didn't have sufficient information for beneficiaries to understand what grants were available. Can I take you to a document which I think we can date in the summer of 2014, which is CAXT 40110_131. It's entitled Support to Beneficiaries. Do we understand that this document is what was published, the updated information that was published on the website in summer 2014?
I think that's the case, yes.
And we can see there the key areas in which grant support is given, and there is set out the same list that we saw in the annual report. Is that right, and where that came from?
That's correct, yes.
Would you agree that even at that stage, that there's quite a lot of grants that are in fact available to the beneficiary population because we see them in the office guidelines that are not set out there? So, for example, there's no mention there about wills, bereavement grants, moving home grants, clothing, complementary therapy, etc.
That is certainly true. I'm not aware we ever gave a grant for complementary therapy, for example. Yes, absolutely. I think looking back, we should have been more explicit.
And do you accept? I think it's implicit from what you said that it would have been of great assistance to beneficiaries to know what they could have applied for, and indeed what they couldn't have applied for. When making applications for grants.
Yes. Certainly. I think as well as the information on the website, if people phoned up the office to inquire about what they could apply for, then I know that the staff would provide, talk through the kind of things that people might apply for if somebody inquired.
Shemit, you can take
but
that.
It ought to have been more explicit on the website as well, I agree.
The second issue, I wonder if you would agree with this, that was raised very clearly in relation to application for single grants at the June 2013 Partnership Group meeting, was a desire on the part of the Partnership Group for the Caxton Foundation to publish the office guideline figures that set out what the authority of the staff were in making, in allowing grants.
And we declined to do that on the basis that this was an internal document, that the argument was that to publish those figures would be misleading because there was always the discretion to provide more than that.
I just want to...
again, with the benefit of hindsight, there's no reason why that could not have been explained alongside any published information.
And I just want to explore that with you a little further, to just understand the basis upon which the figures in the office guideline were reached. Were they research-based, i.e. were they what the Caxton Foundation considered to be a reasonable sum to spend on that particular item?
Yes, essentially. I mean, they were inherited from McFarlane Trust initially and built on from there. So I'm not actually sure what it was. What felt like a reasonable sum of money, but largely based historically on what the McFarlane Trust had previously agreed.
So in what circumstances would the NWC exceed those guideline figures? If that was a reasonable sum, what was it common, in other words, that the NWC would exceed? It would give more than those figures.
I think I don't know how common it was, again, without having a good recollection of all the individual cases, and of course there were a large number. It's hard to say. There were certainly circumstances where we did, on the basis of the request that was submitted to us. But what I can't do for you, I'm afraid, is recall individual circumstances where we made that discretion.
No. Was one of the concerns about publishing the office guidelines, as you set out in your witness statement, that it would be a fear that it would become a shopping list?
That was a bit of a concern, yes. Again, I think just a concern that if we were, as I said in my statement, I think that we're there to provide discretionary support so that people should apply on the basis of need, not what they understand might be available. Now, again, I don't imagine many people would have used that as a shopping list. It is possible that one or two might, but I don't think that would have been by any stretch the majority of people, because as I sort of say, I think in one of my papers to the board, I was very struck by the fact that there were a lot of people living in considerable poverty who asked for very little.
I'm now going to ask you some questions about the process of grant application. But before I do that, more generally, when a beneficiary registered with the Caxton Foundation, is this right, that they had to fill out a census registration form which asked them for details of their income and expenditure, or certainly when in the early years that was the procedure?
That was certainly the procedure in the early years. So as soon as somebody registered with us, they would be sent a census form to complete. That was completely separate from any grant application. So if they later made a grant application, the information in the census would form part of the information that was provided to the Welfare Committee.
So they wouldn't then have to fill out another form setting out what their income and expenditure was for the particular application?
Actually, I think they did. If you've got a copy of the application form there, I think it might well have included something about income and expenditure. So I think we may well have asked for some of the same information twice.
What I think I've got is the census form. Let's have a look. It's AHOH 40126. Personal census form 2011-2012, and then if we go over to the second page, sets out personal details and details of carers. Go over to the third page, sets out evidence income, and you must attach evidence. Go over to the fourth page, savings and expenditure, and go over to the fifth page.
Those just to say, those 2 pages on income and expenditure were extracted by the staff from the census form when grant applications were submitted to the Welfare Committee. We didn't see, they were obviously all anonymised when they came to us, so we didn't see the information at the beginning, but we were certainly given the income and expenditure summary. Which is why I was slightly unclear about whether we asked for the same information twice, but having seen this, it was clearly extracted from the census form.
And we heard evidence from Ms Barlow that when she arrived at the Caxton Foundation, she described the practice being that all beneficiaries were asked to fill out one of these forms every year, whether or not they were making an application for assistance or not. And that she said she thought that was over the top and changed that practice. And so, in fact, that kind of information, that level of information, was only required if a beneficiary was asking for something from the Caxton Foundation.
Yes, that's correct.
So, if having in the early years filled out that form on an annual basis, an applicant then comes to want to make an application to the Caxton Foundation, is it right to understand that they could do that by letter? There wasn't a specific application form, but what they needed to do was provide evidence of the cost of what they wanted and set out reasons why they needed it, and provide either newspaper adverts or quotes.
That's correct. I mean, again, the application form was something that was introduced by Jan in 2013 at the point where we dropped the requirement for the census form for everyone annually. The weakness in this system at the beginning was that it didn't provide enough clarity, I think, for applicants about the information needed. So they were told broadly what to provide, but you'll see that in the early days of the Welfare Committee, if you go through the minutes, there are lots and lots of deferred cases because we didn't have all the information needed. So there was a process of trying to sort of clarify to the beneficiaries what they should provide. But yes, that's absolutely right. There wasn't an application form initially.
And would you accept the level of information that is required both on income and expenditure and in relation to the particular application, i.e. the requirement for multiple quotes and so on, was an onerous process for beneficiaries, particularly in a beneficiary population that is unwell?
Potentially onerous, yes, for some, not necessarily for everyone. I mean, the intention was that the staff, if people were having difficulty completing these forms, then the staff team would be on hand to provide help with that. So there certainly was recognition of that situation. I mean, there was always a question of how much information we ask for. In order to assess charitable need, there's a sort of at least a minimum amount of information needed, I would argue, around income and expenditure, just to understand the personal finances of the family or the individual. And so I think there was a certain amount of this was inevitable just because of the way that we were set up as a charity. The key thing is that, you know, my understanding always was that if people, you know, as I've said before, we had people suffering from brain fog who would have found this incredibly difficult, that there was help provided by the staff for that.
Did Caxton ever consider removing the requirement to provide financial assistance for those households who were receiving means-tested benefits on the basis that they, on the basis of that very early welfare strategy paper that we looked at, that they would, on almost any level, on almost any measure of financial poverty, meet that measure?
No, we didn't.
I'm going to then come on and ask you now about how applications were determined by the NWC, and also if you have any knowledge about how they were determined under the office guidelines by the staff, if you can help us with that. I'm going to ask you some general questions first of all. Did the Caxton Foundation require registrants to show that they had tried to obtain funding elsewhere? We've heard evidence from Macfarlane witnesses that Macfarlane Trust was viewed very much as a provision of last resort. Was the same true of Caxton?
No, I mean, there were circumstances where funding might be available from elsewhere. So if we didn't see ourselves as there as a substitute for other forms of statutory provision. So if support, so for example, if people would be entitled to NHS dental treatment, we didn't pay for private dental treatment. If people were entitled to support for children going to university because of low income, we wouldn't substitute for that. But no, we didn't expect people to have looked elsewhere for support before coming to us. That was certainly never a consideration.
We saw it on the first page of the office guidelines, the maxima provision. If somebody's had grants of more than £3,000, and the matter must go to, over the past year, the matter must go to the NWC. How did the NWC factor that the previous grants into their decision-making process? Was it relevant?
It was useful to have a picture of what people had received so far, but we didn't, apply maxima to the grants that we might then go on to agree. So essentially what we're talking here is about delegated limits of decision making. But certainly there were some recipients who received considerably more than that from Caxton in a year. So again, it was just there to sort of so that we knew what had been agreed so far, but it didn't stop us agreeing more.
How did do you know whether the office staff were required to carry out an assessment of whether or not a particular person could afford what they were applying for themselves by looking at their income and expenditure and balancing them? Is that an exercise that you understood the staff exercising their authority under the office guidelines were carrying out?
I would have expected that kind of judgment call to have been referred to the welfare committee.
So
rather than
the office. So in practice, if somebody made an application that came within office guidelines, then there wasn't in practice a requirement to show charitable need because it would just be granted.
My problem here is that I don't know enough about how the staff operated of the office guidelines to be able to answer that question. I think there was always a consideration of charitable need. I think staff were conscious of not making judgments that ought to be referred to trustees for a decision. So I think, as I said, I would expect that if they were concerned that somebody's income was seemed too high to justify charitable need, that they would have referred that to the welfare committee. So they are still taking account of charitable need, but it's a question of their sort of level of authority for decision making.
And were there, do you recall, any guidelines or protocols or guidance given by the NWC to the office as to how they should carry out that exercise?
I don't recall.
How did the NWC itself decide whether or not charitable need could be made out, looking at income and expenditure?
Well, simply that if someone's income was well in excess of their regular expenditure, generally we would conclude that charitable need had not been demonstrated.
And again, the same question in relation to the NWC.
I mean, relatively, obviously, to what they were asking for as well. So, so if it was a request, if there was a £10,000 difference, say for argument, between expenditure and income, and they were asking for a £200 item, I think we would think, well, that's something they could probably afford, and charitable need isn't demonstrated.
Again, were there any guidelines or protocols as to how to allow the NWC to assess that on a objective basis?
No, it was really on a case, but well, it was effectively a case by case, but then effectively applying a kind of case law approach, if you like. So if we took a decision that somebody with income considerably in excess of their expenditure we wouldn't approve a grant for something, then we would make sure that we applied that same principle next time round. And there was always a dialogue between the welfare committee and staff to make sure that we were consistent in the way that we awarded grants, because we were certainly concerned to have an approach of fairness, that we wouldn't sort of award something to one person and then refuse it to another, or vice versa.
You anticipated my next question, which is, isn't the risk of not having policies or objective criteria committed to writing for all to see, doesn't that give rise to the risk that there is inconsistent and so therefore unfair decision making?
I mean, we were very conscious of not making unfair decision making, and as well as looking at each case on its merits, checking what we always checked what had been awarded previously in similar circumstances to make sure we were consistent. And I think from time to time I certainly did a review of past cases as well to try to ensure that we had been, to just take a sort of a monitor whether we had been consistent and pick out any instances where we weren't.
Can I take you now to a document, CAXT 5062_072, This is a report produced, I believe, by Ros Riley for an NWC meeting in September 2012.
Yeah.
Is this report a typical report that you would receive at the beginning of each meeting, or was this?
No, I think this was. I think this is something that I think we decided that we were going to produce a report each year that would go to the board, and we probably presumably asked Ros to provide that.
If we can go, please, to page 2 of this report.
Mm-hmm.
Under section 4 grants, and she sets out there in the first paragraph, between September 2011 and March 2012 we received a total of 258 requests from 118 people. Total amount requested during this time was nearly 1.5 million. The total amount agreed was just over 377,000. The sum of just over 675,000 was declined, and just over 490,000 was deferred, where no decision was made due to lack of information. And that's what you were talking about in the early days, because of difficulties with the process.
Absolutely. That was really unacceptable, because it meant that we were delaying decisions while asking for further information. If you look at sort of later examples of NWC minutes, certainly from late 2012 into 2013 onwards, there are very, very few applications that are declined and very few deferred as well. But yeah, this was a serious problem in the early days.
And then we see she gives a figure for fuel payments in that period, and then the next paragraph, from the new financial year, so from presumably April 2012 until 30 September 2012, we received a total of 238 requests from 112 people. Total amount requested during this time was just over 758,000. The total amount agreed was just over 350,000, and just over 276,000 was declined, with nearly 166,000 being deferred. Now, I just want to ask you about that, because Mrs. Lloyd, when she gave evidence, suggested that one of the reasons, or in fact the reason why, Caxton did not spend its allocation in the first few years was because beneficiaries were not coming forward to make applications. But if we look at these figures, it suggests rather a different picture, doesn't it? It suggests that beneficiaries were coming forward, but actually lots of applications were being deferred and lots more applications were being declined. Is that right?
That is right, yes. I mean, I think that's the sort of plain from those figures. Yes, I mean, initially there were more applications declined than accepted by quite a way.
Given again what you knew, or what you knew about the levels of poverty that many of the beneficiaries were living in, and the fact that Caxton wasn't spending its full allocation, would you agree that these figures indicate that the NWC and Caxton's policies were far too restrictive, certainly in the early years?
I think in order to sort of take a judgment on that, you'd need to sort of go back and do a look at the reasons why so many applications were declined at that stage. And I mean, what I think we were doing at that point is sort of we were looking at them on the basis of charitable need, and clearly in a large number of cases we didn't feel that charitable need was demonstrated. I don't believe that if somebody was in serious poverty, that we would have decline requests that were truly helpful for them, truly demonstrated charitable need. because we were so conscious of that level of poverty and the importance of doing what we could to alleviate it. So I'm regretting now that in preparation for this I hadn't tried to do more of an analysis of what was declined and why, but it's hard to tell that from the minutes, in truth.
Would you accept as a matter of principle that where an application is unsuccessful, reasons should be given for refusal?
Yes.
And would you accept that? And were reasons given for refusals by the NWC?
We certainly gave reasons for refusal. Absolutely. I mean, those are recorded in the minutes, but in very, very general terms. And certainly, I would have expected that in communicating the outcome back to applicants, that we would have explained the reasons for declining applications. What I don't know as well from these figures is, how many of these declined applications were from how many applicants we got who submitted several requests, some we accepted, some we declined. This doesn't really tell us whether how many people were refused something entirely, and how many received some grants but not others that they'd applied for.
So the refusal figure may be a proportion of an application, including.
It may be, yes. Yes, that's certainly. I would expect that's the case from those numbers.
I'm going to move on to my last topic now, which is in relation to identifying beneficiaries. We've heard some evidence from Mrs. Lloyd in relation to this, but can you recall what was done by the Caxton Foundation prior to the request being made of the Department of Health to fund the Skipton Fund to do a look-back programme, which we understood took place in September 2014. So can you recall what was done by the Caxton Foundation prior to making that request to help identify new beneficiaries?
I correct something there as well. It was the Department of Health's initiative to have the look-back exercise. It wasn't something that Caxton had requested. So again, this whole issue is something that features in discussion among trustees from the outset, and I have to admit a lot more could and should have been done sooner than it was. What was done was to have information on various websites. So there was information about Caxton on websites of the Hepatitis C Trust, Haemophilia Society, Tainted Blood, I think, had something about it on their website. There was information sent to clinicians who might be treating people. But of course, what that didn't do was reach people who might have hepatitis C and were not in touch with any of these organisations or not receiving treatment, and who therefore might not otherwise be aware. And the obvious way always of passing this information on about the existence of Caxton was to contact Skipton 1 recipients who hadn't already applied. And there was a lot of discussion about this, I remember. And what we were told was that this would present an enormous data protection issue because in contacting Skipton 1 recipients may have received their grants quite some years beforehand. There had been no attempt to keep up with people's addresses, so people might have sent us their up-to-date address, but not necessarily. And unless they'd got to the Skipton 2 stage, our contact details for Skipton 1 recipients, we were told, were likely to be very out of date. And that would then lead to the risk that should we attempt to contact people, there would be a proportion of people who had moved home, and in contacting them, we might inadvertently reveal somebody's hepatitis C status, because if we wrote a letter, for example, and somebody who was a new occupant to the house opened it, it would give away information about somebody's HIV status that we would not wish to disclose. So that was the argument that was sort of presented to us as trustees for not going down this route.
By whom? Told by whom?
By the chief executive. I think it would have been discussion with Martin Harvey, I think, at the time. Early on, I sort of raised the question of whether we shouldn't do some national publicity campaign. It felt to me that this was, a big human interest story that the media would be interested in carrying, that it would be something that, if not a news item, a sort of TV magazine program like The One Show would be interested in featuring. We would have needed to have found somebody who was a beneficiary who would be happy to go on TV to talk about it. But there wasn't, I think there was a concern that we didn't have the necessary communication skills in-house, that somehow this might backfire if whoever the media spoke to was critical of Caxton and might put people off coming to us rather than the reverse. And I think this goes back to what feels now like a sort of overly risk-averse feeling that Caxton and its existence would be criticised, and that would mean that any publicity attempt would be potentially hijacked. And I guess that might have been a risk, but there was also an argument for saying that it would get the information out there and people would have then at least know about it and have a choice about whether to come to us. So it was an argument I sort of put forward in the early days. There wasn't much appetite for it, and I confess I didn't really pursue it much after that. There was then the idea that we were going to get somebody on the board who had communication skills, who would sort of come up with ways of better informing beneficiaries of our existence. But that didn't really work. And it was only when we got to the Skipton look-back exercise that we actually began to, and as part of that, people were told about the existence of Caxton, that beneficiary numbers seriously picked up. I mean, there was clearly a gradual increase year on year, but there was a really substantial increase immediately after that look-back exercise. So that begs the question of why it didn't happen sooner. And I'm unclear now how those personal protection issues about inadvertently disclosing somebody's HIV status were managed in the look-back exercise, because clearly they were managed, and the concern that we had that was a problem earlier on must have been a misplaced, I mean, right to have that concern, but it was clearly one that could have been manageable. The other issue, of course, was staffing to do that. DH provided, I think, funding for 2 people to do the look back exercise. But again, what was to stop Caxton petitioning the department to do that earlier?
Last question from me, and it relates to the point you've just raised. Was how were those concerns about disclosure of HCV status dealt with in the look back? Can we look at CAXT 40110_134? This is a report to the board dated the 22nd of October 2014 from the Chief Executive. And its first item, Skipton look-back exercise and impact on beneficiary numbers, and the background is set out there, including DH provided funding for 2 temporary members of staff to work on the project. And then the second paragraph there, during September, up to 6 attempts were made to contact everyone by telephone. This resulted in 936 people, primary beneficiaries and bereaved family members, being spoken to. Those who had previously provided email addresses but who had not been contactable by phone were then emailed. 554 people were contacted in this way, and 110 responses have been received as at 16 October 2014. For anyone not contactable by phone or email, a letter is being sent to the doctor who completed the original Stage 1 form by the end of October, 954 letters. Reading that, does that prompt your memory as to whether or not that is how the exercise was conducted?
This was the only information I had at the time about how the exercise was conducted. I didn't have any direct involvement in it, so I do recall that.
So those are the questions that I had for Mr. Lister. Core participants and their recognised legal representatives will need an opportunity to email in any questions that they wish me to ask. So I wonder if we could take an early lunch break.
Yes. I wonder if how many questions do you anticipate? That's a difficult question, I know.
From core participants?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know, but perhaps we could take a shorter break and.
We can come back. I have some inquiry business to attend to at about 5 to 1, so I need to break in time for that anyway. But shall we see how we go?
Yes.
We'll take a break for a quarter of an hour now, and see if that allows you to field questions. If you need more time, ask, and we may have to adjourn until 2 o'clock in the event.
Yes.
But shall we see how we go?
Yes, thank you.
So a quarter of an hour's break, and that's until essentially quarter to 1. Actually, on reflection, you are right. We'll take a. I don't want to rush core participants. We'll take a break and come back just after 2. So 2 o'clock, shall we say? 2 o'clock. I hope that's all right for you.
Yes, absolutely.